episode 2. And so today I want to talk about a discussion I had with a couple of friends online. And it centers around whether or not homosexuality is natural. Now, I shared a meme, and it was quite tongue-in-cheek, and I know it was going to be quite provocative, but it was with a couple of friends. I was saying, look, there are people out there who believe in a talking snake, that somebody could walk on water, people rose from the dead. But by having all these beliefs, there was the same way that they could say that homosexuality was not natural based on those suggestions from the Holy Book. Now, for context, for those who have been following me on any form of social media who know I used to be a Christian. About 8 or so years ago, I turned my back on the religious faith because I believe you need to have a leap of faith if you are going to be in any specific religion. And for me, I went and I tested and I looked out there. There were 4,000 gods. There were so many other books. And for me, it just wasn't for me. And I walked away from religion and I defined myself as agnostic. And so obviously it sparked off a really big discussion, and hopefully this Sunday coming, I'm going to be in a small debate with a couple of people around that, where we are not necessarily arguing about the whole concepts of homosexuality, but we're discussing it so I can share from my point of view why I believe it's natural, and for those who are going to be debating with me, for them, why they think it's unnatural. So I think for the purpose of discussion, it's very important to define what or how I see homosexuality. And for a phrase that was coined, I think, in 1869 or at the beginning of the 19th century, it refers to same-sex attraction. Now, that can be romantic, where an individual wants to get into a relationship, or it could just be an attraction to somebody from the other from the same gender, from the same sex, but it can be platonic. It doesn't necessarily have to involve anything romantic or sexual. It just can be attraction to somebody of the same sex. And so that's my definition of what homosexuality is, whereas heterosexuality, just for the sake of argument, I know there are others, but heterosexuality is just male-female, whereas homosexuality would be male-male or female-female. That's the way we're going to be able to define it for the purpose of this vlog, even. So for me, one of the reasons why I believe that homosexuality is natural is because I think there are a lot of things that happen in this world that are shaped by many things around us, whether it be genetic, hormonal, environment, whatever it is. I think there are lots of things that will be considered natural. I actually think that in many ways, things like marriages are social constructs. They have been defined by communities and organizations and cultures as a way of being able to provide an economic basis, a way of prolonging family life, a way of protecting your tribe and your genes or your gene pool or your seed. And so those things can be considered natural. And, there's a lot of research that goes out there, or has gone out there, and there hasn't been, there have been discussions, but there's not been any conclusive scientific evidence around a gay gene. And I don't necessarily think there needs to be. In the same way that I don't think that if you are gay, you need to come out, because if you're heterosexual, you don't need to come out. And it's very interesting because I remember that back in the day when I used to be a preacher and I used to be very radical in terms of my religious beliefs, I used to talk about the fact that homosexuality was a perversion. I would refer to things like DSM-4, talking about the way that homosexuality was illegal. I think it was in 1971, the World Health Organization, United Nations, one of these organizations still deemed homosexuality as a perversion and abnormal. And I think that was repealed in 1990 or thereabouts. And for me, I think it's important to get a sense of context when we are talking about whether something is natural is not. What does that actually mean? What's the basis? And when we're talking about environment, I'll talk about this a bit later, there are a number of cultures and traditions around the world where homosexuality was just something that was the norm. Yes, we knew that you had to be able to have a heterosexual partnership in order to be able to have children along the way, but deeming it unnatural, what does that necessarily mean? And what I realised, and this comes to my third point, the reason why a lot of people deemed homosexuality unnatural was because they didn't necessarily define it as just about same-sex attraction, but they deemed it unnatural because of the sexual act. And primarily, I know this from the background that I come from, so it's very influenced by an African Caribbean culture. Homosexuality is defined primarily in terms of the sexual act between two males. So, for example, when you think of objections against homosexuality, or whether it's It's primarily gay, referring to men, rather than lesbian, referring to women. You don't really hear that much when referring to women. You hear the objections from guys, is that a lot of it refers to sodomy or anal sex. And so a lot of people will say, look, that's not the way, your penis is not supposed to fit into a man's bum, and that's not the way things are supposed to go. So as far as we're concerned, it's actually unnatural. And for me, if you're going to use that context, you need to be able to take a lot of other things into consideration. For example, if you're a couple and you have a bit of a problem actually having children, you use IVF. IVF is not natural. If you are an individual and you have been involved in, and if you're a child, cover your ears, in cunnilingus or fellatio, or as we know on the road as a blowjob, or if you are, shall we say, going down on the lady, it's important to recognise that oral sex isn't natural either, because that's not about reproduction, but there is a sense of sensual pleasure. Masturbation. Masturbation is not natural if you really want to think about it. Yes, there probably are loads of people around the world pleasuring themselves while going onto various porn sites, but does it go for actual reproduction? And no one would necessarily exclude IVF, oral sex, or masturbation as unnatural. And here's the kicker. There are a lot of heterosexual people who also have anal sex as part of their sexual pleasure. Yes, they may not necessarily be having it as as the standard, but anal, oral sex, masturbation, and IVF, these are all things, a part of a sexual act, that some other people would deem unnatural. And for me, that's a bit silly, because you have to recognize that these things are part and parcel of our environment, as part and parcel of the relationships that individuals have. Would you really honestly and go say to a loving couple who are having oral sex as part of their relationship that it is unnatural? Yes, of course, there are going to be some people that will throw a religious book here, there, and everywhere. But generally speaking, within society, we would not consider that unnatural. So I understand it from a religious point of view, because there are many texts in the Bible that will talk about the male and female sitting, lying together, and that being unnatural or natural. Often people who don't have a real cursory reading of the Bible, and take it from somebody who was a former theologian who read the Bible both in Hebrew, Greek, Koine Greek, and Aramaic to get an understanding of the context, a lot of the objection against homosexuality was primarily against pederasty, where high priests of varying religions and cultures around the Jewish, nomadic Jewish tradition, what they would do is they would have sexual orgies, and they would be using and abusing specifically young boys as part of that ceremony. And a lot of the objections that were given, whether it was in the New Testament or the Old Testament, was around child sacrifice. It was around pederasty. It wasn't necessarily around the homosexual act between just two men, or even in some cases two women. Yes, there are some texts by all means that will say that they don't want that as part of the tradition within the Jewish tradition, but not everybody's Jewish. And to be honest with you, a lot of the stuff that was contained within the Old Covenant, which also included a lot of the stuff in Leviticus around health, around sleeping in the same bed as a woman who was on a period, around eating things with web feet, all those dietary, the way you would go into another person's country and you would take their wife and or their daughter, and you kill all the men, and all these things which were part of the Old Covenant, which are all part of the Levitical or Deuteronomy in the Bible, all those things were removed or replaced with the New Covenant, because it was more about a mindset rather than the newest tradition to try and get anywhere closer to God. Likewise, you can think of other religions like Islam and others where they would look down on homosexuality, but primarily in these situations it focused on the male. Why? Because there was something about the male ego. Even if you look in today at something like Kuwait or Turkmenistan, lesbian sex is fine, but gay sex, you will get killed. And in majority Muslim theocracy countries, there are individuals where if you do have gay sex between a men, you'll probably be put to death. There is more of a chance of that, and you don't really hear about that in terms of women. So yes, there is going to be a religious context, but to be honest with you, if you want to believe in a book that talks about angels and people resurrecting from the dead, and all the other kind of myths and legends that people have in a religion to obviously substantiate them, that's what you're going to go for. But as somebody who doesn't believe in that, I'm not going to take that as my guide as to whether or not something is or is not natural. So I want to finish off on this last bit here, and it's to say that, across the world, in terms of history, I think of the Fa'afin in Samoa, and I've got my list here, so I'm going to look at it, thinking of going back many centuries ago in Congo. You had the Azande, who were warriors in Congo, who had younger men as their partners, and you had, going back even to to 2400 BCE in Egypt. You had image and hieroglyphics of Egyptians with the intimacy you could see of the nose kissing, and there were senior pharaohs and senior courtiers who had same-sex relationships. There were those who could argue that even if you look in the book of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or even the book that was very similar to, which was the Bible, you can think of people like David and Jonathan, who were individuals who you could say, they had a similar relationship. And let's be honest, look, Jesus was a guy who hung around with 12 guys. There were no women in there. Okay, there was Mary on the side, but it was not 12 guys hang out for 3.5 years. Some people could say, there might be a bit of an attraction, but I'm not going to cast any dispersion upon that, but just saying, hey, there may have been the possibility. In the indigenous American population, you know of the what was called the two spirits. The two spirits, where individuals could be heterosexual, but at the same time they could also be a homosexual attraction as well. In China, in 600 BCE, there were records of same-sex attraction between men and women. And if you even think about even more towards the Middle East, if you think of the Almanac of Incantations, which was found in Assyria, you will also find that there were prayers and supplications for individuals who had same-sex relationships. So yes, we can talk about the animal kingdom, but I want to focus primarily on humanity for here. If somebody's attracted to another person, trying to link that to paedophilia or bestiality or all those other things, or the other weak arguments that people use in referencing homosexuality, I think it's a bit poor, and I think it's because individuals have not been able to grasp a real good argument as to whether or not homosexuality is natural. For me, I do believe it's a natural thing, because I think nature is not just about what you deem only from genes or what you deem only from the Bible, because how do you define asexuality, where individuals aren't attracted to a specific sex? How do you determine things like hermaphrodites, who are born with both of the organs? How do you determine 10% of the population who are left-handed? What about twins? What about individuals who are born with capabilities of being able to be incredibly smart? Or people who maybe are born with disabilities? Do we say those individuals are unnatural? Would you say that somebody who has got Down syndrome is unnatural? No, you wouldn't, because we know there's variations of what humanity actually is. So decrying and putting down somebody because their sexuality or their sexual attraction is not the norm, and it's not about reproducing for children. And bear in mind, if you are in a homosexual relationship and you are a gay or lesbian, you can actually still have children. It's still very possible. But decrying individuals because they don't align to your way of thinking, for me, I think is really sad, and I think it's short-sighted. So those are my arguments. I look forward to your feedback in the comments below. Thank you very much for listening. Peace.